Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kakis, and today I'm going to be joined by Rachel Tilghman, Senior Solutions Consultant at Sprinklr. The topic of today's episode is giving back to the local community. Rachel is someone who is actively involved in not only the PreSales Collective, but the local Austin community at large. She has an amazing perspective on community and the value of community. And so in today's episode, we're going to talk to Rachel about her experiences, pre-sales related and non-pre-sales related, about giving back, why she gives back, some examples and some really great stories of things that she's done in terms of creating community and building that network, and also discuss what pre-sales professionals can do to build local community. And a little spoiler alert, with PreSales Collective next year in 2022, we have a new and amazing mechanism to allow anybody who wants to host a community event to be able to. You're going to hear from Rachel's perspective. You're going to hear my perspective on community. And I really hope you find a lot of value in this episode. Enjoy. Today's episode is sponsored by Avneo. Feeling a little overwhelmed in your bid management? Thinking there must be a better and more efficient way to manage RFPs, RFIs, and security questionnaires? Look no further than Avneo RFX, a Salesforce native, fully automated RFX solution designed to help you win more of the right business. To learn more, head over to avneo.com or search Avneo in the Salesforce App Exchange. Rachel, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, James?
I'm great. I'm so glad to have you on here. You've been such an amazing contributor to the PreSales Collective and to the community at large. And I just want to talk about you and what you've done today. And I'm just so appreciative and thankful for all the energy that you're putting into building community within the PreSales Collective.
Thank you, James. It has been such a wild ride, and I have really loved every minute of connecting with the Austin community here.
It's so great to see the momentum that we've had in Austin, but I want to hold on that momentarily because as we talk about community, you are the perfect person to bring on. You're involved at your own company. You're involved in PreSales Collective. You're involved in other groups that are non-PreSales related. But one thing that we've talked about before is this X team that you're on at Sprinklr. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that team is and why it actually relates to today's episode?
Yeah, for sure. So the X team is kind of our secret sauce for the solutions consulting org at Sprinklr. So it is a voluntary group of people that we like to call ourselves kind of the fun committee, but we also believe in developing the culture at Sprinklr for our solutions consultants. So it's not really like an HR driven initiative at all. It's really particular to just the SC org. We host all of our events. We're responsible for connecting people. We've done some really fun things like presentation karaoke across the organization. We did that like March Madness bracket style. And really what we're trying to do is promote a sense of community and culture within Sprinklr as we grow. So even since I joined 2 years ago now, the solutions consultant org has grown like 2x. And so our big charter is how do we make sure that people feel included and welcome and part of the team and that they're contributing to, a really great culture. So that's kind of during my day job. And then the PreSales Collective is kind of on top of that. I just love layering those two things together.
That's awesome, Rachel. And I love that you're doing that at your company. You made a mention of something that I think everybody talks about. Like as companies grow and as they scale, this concept of culture continues to shift and change and evolve. It's always on people like yourself and what you're doing with the X team to make sure that the best aspects of that culture at a small company continue to grow to keep people happy and engaged and being fulfilled in their job. I've had this conversation with a few folks. This is why I believe PreSales Collective has kind of stepped in during this entire pandemic, because a lot of times we felt that we needed community and culture by going to the office, traveling with our colleagues, talking in the kitchen, whatever that might be. That has been primarily gone over the past year and a half. And so insert communities where people are connecting about pre-sales or even other non-pre-sales components and realizing like, hey, I can talk about sales engineering or my demo to someone who doesn't work at my company, but also understands what I do because they do a similar function. And so this like concept of community and what's happened with the pandemic is so interesting. So I do love that you are on this team at Sprinklr to make sure that that core culture stays true as you grow and scale.
It's been a huge privilege. It was something that was started way before my time, and we've been kind of passing the baton and the torch and then growing the X team as Sprinkler grows, which has just been really exciting. But I think the other thing that you hit on there is the idea that like you can get so much from people outside of your organization. It's great to share cross-functionally or across regions within your org, but I've gotten so much out of the PreSales Collective too, because I'm like, oh, they're approaching it in a completely different way. Let me think about that or try that on for size. And I think the exchange of ideas, whether it's internal or external, just makes you so much sharper.
I think having a perspective and understanding how people are doing it either validates your opinion or makes you challenge status quo. And that's where innovation happens. Like to hear you say that. But Rachel, let's talk about you a little bit. You obviously have talked about your Sprinkler experience, but tell us about your pre-sales journey. What got you to where you are today?
So like pretty much everyone you interview, pre-sales was not my life plan. Didn't know about it until honestly, I joined Sprinkler. Prior to being in pre-sales, I actually was in marketing and communications for the first 8-10 years of my career. I did that for large corporations. I did it in the public sector for universities. I actually did it while I was living abroad in New Zealand. So I worked for the Fulbright program, doing a lot of more on the execution side of marketing and communications. And then when a friend, actually, speaking of community, a friend that I went to college with was living in Austin, mentioned that he worked at Sprinkler. He was raving about it. I looked up a job description and was like, oh, I could do that for a solutions consultant. And it was just the coolest journey to kind of learn like, oh, wow, I can actually use my presentation skills and my technical skills and my experience as a marketer because we sell CX software. It was kind of the perfect storm for me. So that's how I found out about it. And I actually joined just before the pandemic. So February of 2020 is really when I launched my pre-sales career.
That's wonderful to hear. And I always emphasize relying on your subject matter expertise. So many people say, hey, how do I get into pre-sales? It's like, you're probably a subject matter expert with something. So finding a technology company like you did to utilize that strength is amazing to hear. Rachel, I want to dive into today's topic of giving back to the local community. And you've mentioned a couple things so far. Can you talk about your involvement in the Austin community, pre-sales and non-pre-sales related?
I moved to Austin in 2019 after spending 3 years abroad in New Zealand. And so I've lived a lot of different places in my adult life. I feel like I move every 3 to 5 years, which means I guess technically I have a couple more years left in Austin. But everywhere that I've lived, whether it was California or Chicago or Wellington and now Austin, I found the community aspect so critical to success. And so when we moved to Austin, I really was like, okay, we have some friends and some people introduced me to people and we had a lot of visitors. But in terms of finding a community, I looked how can I volunteer? What's important to Austin? I'm love live music, but not a musician myself. So what else can we do in Austin? And so there were a few things that I got involved with, a couple of women's organizations. But when I joined Sprinkler and I was in this new city and new career, I was like, okay, I got to find something to lean on during this huge transition.
That's great to hear. And I am curious, why are you so involved? I can hear the benefits. And a lot of times, even with Pre-Sales Collective, I see people getting engaged when they're looking to make that career transition or looking for a job or moving, and then they kind of take a step back. But you've stayed fairly engaged. Why is that?
I think there's two things. Community is very much what gives me energy. I am a people person. I love talking to people. I need people. Being locked up in my house during 2020 was not my highlight. So I think there's one part of me that's very much, it's where my energy comes from. But then I think there's another part of me that's really learned some hard lessons. If I think back to New Zealand, that was probably one of the hardest real life pieces of humble pie I've ever had to take a bite of. I moved myself and my partner and 2 friends without knowing anyone, without a job, without really any plan, which is a cute thing you can do once in your 20s. But the biggest realization for me was, oh, I don't have anyone here and I don't know anyone. And so, after about 3 or 4 months of really struggling in New Zealand, beautiful place to struggle, but, struggle nonetheless. I really kind of got my butt into gear and was trying to grasp at anything that was like, how can I make connection? How can I give back? How can I become involved? Like, what's important? What are the values? What's the culture? I need to dig in here and figure this out. So I kind of learned the hard way how slow and painful it is to try to do something when you don't have a support system. That to me is what community is. It's really something that you put a deposit into, but you can also lean on when you're struggling. And we all go so much farther together. There's a lot of things. I saw other expats from the US move to New Zealand, especially working with a Fulbright program, where they had all this stuff set up for them because they went with a group of people and they all figured it out together and they all had this community, for lack of a better. And I remember being like really bitter and being like, what? Like, that was so easy for you guys. Like, are you joking? Like, that was something that took me months to figure out. So I feel like it became a little bit of a life hack to me. It's like, oh, if you ask other people, you get so much further, faster. And I'm a big efficiency person. I really like to figure it out and do it once and do it well. Fast forward, when I moved to Austin, it was that lesson I had learned. You just are like, okay, I'm in a new place. I'm doing something new. Let's figure this out.
It's such a great story and great perspective. Putting in and, like I said, making a deposit that pays you back, right? And pays you back in droves. I can hear the joy when you talk about building community and that sense of pride. Is there a specific example or story that you could share with us where like community really came into play for you?
I love that we're actually recording this right around the holidays because Friendsgiving or Thanksgiving with friends is honestly one of my favorite ways to celebrate. Love celebrating with family too, but it's funny that you mention it because I've actually become a little bit infamous for my Thanksgivings or my Friendsgivings. My last year in New Zealand, I think my proudest moment was I actually got street permits. I shut down the street. I hosted Thanksgiving for 40 people in the middle of the road. I have photos. There's one long table. I rented tables and chairs. Everybody brought a dish to share. And to me, that was so special. Like if someone asks, coolest thing you've ever done in your life, I was like shutting down the street to host Thanksgiving in New Zealand, 100%. There were other Americans who were like, hey, I wouldn't have celebrated otherwise, which was super meaningful. But then there were also Kiwis who had never experienced a Thanksgiving before. That is something that it was such a labor of love, especially when you think about some of the like logistics in New Zealand are not easy. We had to import a turkey from Australia. There's all these like weird things when you're living very close to Antarctica at the bottom of the world that like you don't really think about. But it was such an energy giving activity. So when I think about like bringing people together, that's immediately where my mind goes, is like that full street full of people and everybody just really making connections, especially bleeding parts of your lives together. Like I had work people there. I had people from a women's group that I was part of. I had the neighbors that I live next door to, all these people who otherwise wouldn't have connected coming together. And I think if I kind of had to summarize what brings me the most joy or energy, it would be those moments.
That is one of the coolest things I've ever heard. Shutting down the street and throwing a Friendsgiving party. That's amazing. One thing that you just said there that really resonates with me. One of my favorite things in life is when different groups throughout my life or different friend groups come together for one moment. You can really just see how powerful community really is. I love that you mentioned that. And I love that story. It sounds like you're going to have to throw another street party in Austin. PreSales Collective is going to have to make an appearance.
Well, it's funny because I actually just hosted Austin Friendsgiving last weekend and we had about 20 people. And right now, 20 people, I can fit 2 8-foot tables on our back deck. But if we double in size, which is my history, we normally go from like 10 to 20. So we're looking at 40 and I don't have a 40-person entertainment space. So we may be shutting down a street next year. Who knows?
Love it. Well, it's now on record. So
yeah.
Rachel, how did you get involved in PreSales Collective anyway?
So I got to give a major shout out to Pavel Martin. He's in the UK right now. He was just moving to London as I was joining Sprinkler, and we were on the same team, the West Coast team, shout out. And Pavel posted in one of our Slack channels about it, or, I think he is someone I really look up to in my pre-sales career. And so when he was like, hey, there's this community, I was like, that's exactly what I've been looking for. Give me more. Like, what do you know? That's how I found out about pre-sales and you guys and the work that you were doing, James, which was really exciting to me. Also, that you had some Chicago roots, because I started my career in Chicago, many moons ago.
I love it. Again, thanks. Shout out to Pavel and all the work that he's done with the PreSales Collective and helping grow the UK group, the enablement program. Again, this is just a validation of everything that we're talking about when it comes to the network effect. Austin has been a model local community for the PreSales Collective. There's just so many great events going on and so much community building, and more than just a panel discussion or grabbing beers or coffee. What are some of the events that you've done in Austin for PreSales Collective?
We started last December actually with a virtual happy hour because we were still peak COVID. And we've kind of evolved. We've done some career panels that was virtual. We've done some happy hours, which have actually been in person all around Austin. We are really excited. We've started doing these morning coffee meetups once a month, an idea we also kind of stole from the UK chapter. They're doing theirs virtually. And, Austin, the weather's pretty good year round, so we can meet up outside and grab a coffee. And so Jack has been taking that on. And then actually coming up in just a couple of weeks, we have our holiday party. We have another coffee meetup. So really all sorts of things, because I think it's important that people find what they're looking for, whether they want to go and hear an inspirational speaker, or they want to learn something about their career, or they just want to connect with someone and ask them, what is your day-to-day like? And kind of get some of that feedback. So giving people lots of options has been really good for building momentum in Austin.
It's great to see the momentum, and I'm super excited for the happy hours and the community service and everything that you're doing. Let me put you on the spot with a little bit of a tough question. In my position, I've got to see local being built across the world, sometimes in the city, sometimes state, country level, geo-regional level, both in person and virtual. So I'm curious, the momentum that's happened in Austin, is it due to the work of you and the leadership team, or is it just Austin as a city and the willingness for community?
I think it's a little bit of a perfect storm. I think there's two things happening. One, PreSales Collective is awesome. We can't take credit for Elon Musk coming in and building Tesla headquarters here. There's quite a bit of movement, energy, and momentum already organically happening in Austin. And I think we've really been able to harness some of that. So, we have a really transient population, people that are moving into the city, people that are looking for connection and trying to build something. So that is a really good breeding ground for community. I think the second piece of it that I really want to call out is that not every event is like 100-person shut down the street event that requires quite a bit of muscle. If you post in your Slack channel, like, hey, I want to grab coffee with someone, and one other person shows up, that's community. And so I think that it's really just been taking these baby steps to say, hey, we're going to do one thing. Okay, now we're going to do a second thing. It's these small building blocks that have capitalized on the momentum and energy that Austin is already feeling and has allowed us to experience such success.
You absolutely nailed that answer, Rachel. I really love that perspective. And, it's one of the things that we've asked ourselves internally as PreSales Collective is, how do we define success? Is it actually that we're having the event, or is it the quality of the event? Is it the attendance of the event? And I think that what you said resonates the most. It's just having the event, in my opinion. And one of the things that we are moving to as a community for next year, in places where we don't have a large presence, is the ability for community members to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to throw an event. We've done this in St. Louis. We've done this in Philadelphia. We're doing this in a couple cities in Florida, where we don't necessarily have a chapter, but there only might be a dozen or 2 dozen people signed up in the PreSales Collective. But it's okay. Let's just offer coffee, let's offer co-working, let's offer drinks after work, and just get people together to build that network. You're right. We don't need this large scale production events. And with where the world is right now, PreSales Collective is handling that from the virtual perspective. And so we want to continue to build community. And to further double down on some of the things that I'm really hoping for, I want people to go into the Slack and say, hey, I'm going on a bike ride on Saturday. Who wants to join me? I see that happening in Colorado all the time, and it's amazing. To me, that is where community comes into play and where PreSales Collective really goes beyond just like, let's talk about pre-sales. Let's actually build friendships. Let's build network. Let's find people that have similar interests and hobbies outside of just selling software or just doing demos. And that's where the magic happens. As you and the Austin team continue to offer co-working spaces and coffee get-togethers, that is what this whole thing is all about. And, we're really looking to create that mechanism for people next year, really, because that's what we've become, is just a platform to allow people to host events, to get people together, because now we have the mechanism to raise awareness.
I absolutely love that, James. And I wholeheartedly agree that it really is so much more than, hey, every month we host a happy hour. It's like those little organic moments. To me, quality of event is quality of connection. And so if you and one other person show up, that's a success because you're going to have a quality connection with that one other person. So sometimes it's actually easier to get that quality of event, if you will, as you're small and you're figuring things out and, 3-4 people show up. I think some people have this vision in their mind that to be successful, they need big attendance and big turnout and all these whiz bang firework things. And it actually, to me, is so much easier to build that relationship when you have a small group. So you got to start somewhere. And I think that's just so valuable.
Absolutely. Rachel, I want to ask you some advice questions as we get to the end of this podcast. What advice do you have for people who want to meet with other individuals, whether it's happy hour or coffee, but they don't have the time or the energy to put on a large scale production event?
I think just popping a Slack in the channel and saying, hey, I'm going to go do this at this date at this time, and being prepared that if no one shows up, like, cool. But if one person replies to your Slack thread, you get their phone number and you make arrangements. I think making it as easy and really low lift for yourself. We all have so much going on. And I think we all learn from those little James and I had a really good time going to coffee. Let's add one more person to the mix next time. Just posting something in the Slack channel that you're passionate about. I think the other piece of it is that if you do see an event, like if there is an event that's been organized by leaders in your group and you're like, oh, I'm really busy or I feel burnt out at the end of the day, definitely ask yourself, what are your expectations from showing up? And how can you plan for it to be an energy giving activity? So if you're like, I've had a really long day, I know I RSVP'd to this, I don't know if I'm actually going to go. I think giving yourself why did I RSVP in the first place? And just challenging yourself to show up and be present in the moment and being excited about making that one connection. To me, that's a success. I know that's something that, even though I'm obviously extroverted and love community, there are still days when I'm like, wow, I've really been wiped out. And so I think making sure you're kind to yourself, but also don't let those opportunities to meet someone that could change your career pass you by. And that's what I view every one of these connection points as.
That is great advice and great feedback for our community. How about advice for those who really want to get reoccurring events on the calendar or have these events in Tampa or Orlando or Jacksonville, Florida, where we might not have a lot of pre-sales folks, but they want to build that consistent community? What advice do you have for them?
I would say start small, be realistic about your goals. Don't put a lot of pressure on yourself to find people that may or may not exist yet. But building community is something that grows over time. It's a snowball effect, right? It's not one big lightning strike. Don't put pressure on yourself to do one huge event and then exhaust yourself and not have anything for 6 months. Like that really will frustrate you and frustrate your community. if you can do a couple small things here and there, if you can find a couple of friends to share the load, I think that's also been something that's been so critical to Austin's success, is that we've really tried to rotate who owns which event and who needs help with certain things, so that it's not resting on one person to do something every single month or every other month, whatever might be good, but also so that your community can expect some consistency.
That is such great feedback, Rachel. And I'm so happy you said that, because in my mind, the consistency aspect is the most important aspect of this conversation. If you go and say, hey, we're going to get together in whatever city, and you have this one event, you say, hey, we're going to do this every other month, and you communicate that out there, and then you disappear for the next 6 months, I think it ends up being a poor reflection on you individually, but also it kind of disappoints the rest of that community. We're trying to figure out ways to make sure that people are supported where they want supported, and we continue to build that community with low energy and low effort, but make sure that the impact is really felt across, whether it's one person, 2 people, 10 people, or more.
There's 2 things I'd probably add to that, James, right? I shared with my Thanksgiving story that I went from 10 people to 20 people to 40 people in New Zealand. And I mean that very seriously. Like, that took time and energy to build. It's not like I showed up in a foreign country and bang, rented tables and chairs for 40. If you keep that in mind, know that it was a 3-year process to get those kind of results. That can give people a lot of comfort and say, like, okay, like, these little steps that I'm taking are going to make a really big difference. The other thing that I've found from doing this for a couple of years is that your light on your candle doesn't diminish by lighting someone else's. So if you have an event and someone else is super jazzed and is like, hey, I want to do something, embrace that. Take advantage of that new energy and say, great, what do you want to host? How can we help you, give you some resources to make sure that they're successful? And then maybe someone else at that event will get super excited, and it kind of creates this domino effect. And then you're in a position where it's not all on your shoulders, and it's not something that you feel like you have to manage. And just because someone volunteers to host an event once doesn't mean they suddenly need to sign a contract to you and do something every day. Take advantage of the energy that you're creating and recognize that that's what community is.
Wow. I love the candle example, lighting the candle and passing that on. That's great. Rachel, it has been amazing having you on the podcast today. I really appreciate your time, your energy, everything that you're doing for the Austin community and really the PreSales Collective at large. And this has been a wonderful time spent. And I will definitely be passing this podcast on to anybody who wants to get people together in person for a local community.
Thank you so much, James. And I hope you have a happy holiday.
You as well, Rachel. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.
All right, PreSales Collective, that was an amazing episode. I love so much of what Rachel had to say. From when we just started, she works on this team called the X team at Sprinkler that helps build culture as the company grows and scales. It is such a hard thing to do for companies, and to have a volunteer committee within your sales engineering organization that does that is mission critical to growth and success. If you hear Rachel's story, she's moved around a lot. And what that means is you have to build a network. And every time you move to a new city, you're building a new network, you're building community and getting something out of it. And when Rachel talks about her story of being in New Zealand and throwing a Friendsgiving and actually shutting down the street, that is such a cool and powerful story. And all the different groups, including locals in New Zealand that came together for that event, that is the power of bringing people together. So for Rachel and the PreSales Collective, it's great to see that they have built so much momentum. The Austin community gets together for coffee, for happy hours, for community service. And that is what we as PreSales Collective want to continue to promote. I firmly believe that with the new normal that exists now, the role of the company building culture can somewhat change. And this is where community has stepped in, because people realize they can build relationships with people that don't work at their company. Ryan Lavallee said this in the New York event in mid-2021, that it was the first time in 18 months he was in a room full of people who knew what he did for a living. And that is why for PreSales Collective, we're always trying to promote the concept of finding our people. because this role is such an incredible role that so many people don't know about. But once you talk to somebody, say, oh, you're in sales engineering, there's instant credibility. There's an instant connection built. And we want to continue to foster that. As I mentioned, we have a new mechanism to allow for in-person events to happen. In January 2022, be on the lookout for presalescollective.com/contribute, and you're going to be able to request events in local cities. You're going to be able to raise your hand for podcasts or blogs or webinar events. We want to continue to foster this amazing community around presales by providing a mechanism, a vehicle for people to get together. If you've listened today and taken any of the advice that Rachel says, just show up. If you're wanting to build some community, send a message in Slack and say, hey, I'm going to go grab coffee or grab drinks on this day and this time. If anybody wants to join, please join me. If you want to say, hey, I'm going for a bike ride. If anyone wants to join me, please do. That is the sense of community and the sense of belonging that we want to continue to promote with the PreSales Collective. If you have any thoughts on today's episode, any feedback, I am going to encourage you to message me, reach out to me. I really mean that. Please do. I'm happy to offer my thoughts and my advice. All right, PreSales Collective, as always, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you next week.